The wind did not just blow in the high Rockies during the late autumn of 1878. It hunted. It moved through the granite passes with a sound like tearing metal, searching for cracks in the chinking of log cabins, seeking out the warmth of living things to snuff them out. Silas Crow sat inside his rough-hewn shelter, a structure that clung to the side of the mountain just above the timberline like a barnacle on the hull of a ship. He was a man composed of hard angles and scar tissue, nearly 60 years of age, though the weather in the high country had carved lines into his face that made him look older. His hair was the color of iron filings, long and tied back with a strip of leather, and his beard grew thick to protect his throat from the chill. He sat at a small table he had built himself 20 years ago, cleaning a rifle that was already clean. It was a ritual, a way to keep his hands moving when the silence became too loud. The fire in the cast-iron stove popped, spitting a spark against the grate, but it did little to chase the damp cold from the corners of the room. Silas laid the rifle down and rubbed his left knee. The joint was a knot of old pain, a souvenir from a fall down a scree slope when he was a younger, more foolish man. His hip ached in sympathy. He could predict the weather by the torture in his bones, and today his bones were screaming. A storm was coming, not a dusting, but a burying. He looked around the cabin. It was sparse, defined by utility. A bunk against the wall piled with buffalo robes and wool blankets, a shelf of tin goods, their labels fading, a locked tin box beneath his bed that held papers he never read, and a daguerreotype he never looked at. He lived alone because he had chosen isolation, or perhaps because isolation had chosen him after the incident at Dead Horse Creek years ago. That memory lived in the tin box, and it lived in the nightmares that woke him sweating in the dead of winter. Rumors had drifted up from the valley floor 2 weeks ago, carried by a trapper passing through on his way to the Sweetwater. The man had spoken of a land speculator named Price who was buying up claims with paper money and threats. He spoke of the law tightening like a noose, deputies who were more hired gun than peacekeeper. Silas had listened, nodded, and given the man a piece of dried venison to make him leave. He wanted no part of the world below, but the world below had a way of climbing. The light outside the single grease paper window began to fail early, the sky turning the color of a bruised plum. The wind picked up, screaming through the pines below the ridge. The temperature dropped so fast Silas could hear the timbers of the cabin groan as they contracted. He stood up, wincing as his knee locked, and grabbed his heavy coat. He needed to check the snare line one last time before the whiteout hit. If the snow grew too deep, he would lose whatever meat the traps held, and his supplies were already dangerously low. He pushed the door open. The cold hit him like a physical blow, a solid wall of freezing air that turned the moisture in his nose to ice instantly. He lowered his head and pushed into the gale. The world was already dissolving into white. Snow pellets stung his face. He checked the first snare, empty. The second, empty. He moved with a slow, deliberate gait of a man who knows that rushing on ice is a good way to die. Near the third snare, underneath the shelter of a twisted spruce, he saw a shape that did not belong. It was not a deer, nor a wolf. It was a mound of dark fabric, half buried in the drift. Silas knelt, his heart hammering a warning against his ribs. He brushed the snow away with a gloved hand. It was a woman. She was curled into a tight ball, her knees pulled to her chest. She wore a man's heavy wool coat that was far too large for her, the sleeves covering her hands entirely. Beneath it, the hem of a ragged calico dress fluttered in the wind. Her boots were split at the seams, the leather gray and useless. Silas touched her neck. There was a pulse, faint and thready, like a moth trapped under glass. She is going to die, he thought. If I leave her, she dies in an hour. He looked back toward his cabin, barely visible through the driving snow. If he took her in, he invited the world back into his life. He invited questions. He invited the possibility of trouble, for young women did not collapse on mountain peaks in the middle of a blizzard unless they were running from something terrible. He cursed into the wind. The sound lost instantly. He scooped his arms under her. She was shockingly light, nothing but bone and gristle. Her head lolled against his shoulder, her skin the color of blue milk. He turned and marched back toward the cabin, his bad leg protesting every step, dragging his feet through the rising drifts. Inside, he kicked the door shut and bolted it against the wind. The silence of the room felt sudden and heavy. He laid her on his bunk and began to strip the frozen layers from her body. It was not an act of intimacy, but of survival. He removed the sodden coat, the wet boots, the stockings that were more holes than wool. Her feet were white and waxy with the beginning of frostbite. He chafed her hands and feet with rough wool, trying to bring the blood back without tearing the skin. He built the fire up until the stove glowed cherry red. He heated water and dissolved a precious chunk of dried beef into it to make a broth. Then, he sat in the chair and watched her. He watched her hands. They were cracked raw, the nails broken, the palms calloused. These were hands that knew labor. He watched her face. Even in the slackness of unconsciousness, there was a tension between her brows, a look of worry etched deep. She looked to be 23 or 24 years of age, old enough to know the cruelty of the world, young enough to still be broken by it. She stirred an hour later. Her eyes snapped open, wide and panicked. She did not wake slowly. She woke like an animal trapped in a corner. She scrambled backward, pressing herself against the log wall, her breath coming in sharp gasps. "Peace," Silas said, his voice rusty from disuse. "You are safe." She looked at him, her eyes darting to the door, then to the rifle on the table, then back to his face. She was shivering violently, her teeth chattering. "Drink this," Silas said, holding out the tin cup of broth. She stared at the cup. She did not reach for it. Her eyes were dark, intelligent, and filled with a profound lack of trust. "I am not going to hurt you," Silas said. "If I wanted you dead, I would have left you in the snow." The logic seemed to reach her. She reached out a trembling hand and took the cup. She drank it greedily, the hot liquid burning her throat, choking slightly before draining the dregs. "More?" she whispered. It was the first word she had spoken. Slowly, Silas said, "You will make yourself sick." He took the cup and refilled it halfway. "Who are you?" he asked. She hesitated. She looked at the fire, avoiding his gaze. "Clara," she said. "Clara Hale. How did you get up here? Clara Hale. Walking." She said, "That is a long walk from town. I had to leave." "Why?" She looked at him then, and Silas saw a flash of defiance in her eyes that surprised him. "Because I was not welcome anymore." She pulled the buffalo robe tighter around her shoulders. She looked at the man's coat hanging by the fire to dry. "That coat did not fit you," Silas observed. "I found it," she said quickly, "on a fence post." Silas knew a lie when he heard one, but he did not press. He saw the way she flinched when a log settled in the fire with a loud crack. He saw the bruises on her wrists that were fading from purple to yellow. "You are a long way from anywhere," he said. "The pass is snowed in. You are stuck here until the melt, or until the weather breaks long enough to risk the descent." Clara looked at the door. "I can go," she said. "I do not need charity." "You would die before you reach the timberline," Silas stated flatly. She fell silent. She looked around the cabin, assessing her cage. Silas stood up to put more wood on the fire. As he rose, his knee buckled. It was a genuine stumble, a sharp spike of pain that made him grunt. He caught himself on the table. Clara watched him, her eyes narrowing. In that moment, a thought took root in Silas's mind. It was a dark, selfish thought, born of 60 years of loneliness and a sudden, terrifying realization. If she thought he was capable, she would leave the moment the snow stopped. She would try to run, and she would die, and he would be alone again with the wind screaming outside. But if she thought he was useless, if she thought he was a broken old man who needed her help, he let out a groan, louder than necessary, and collapsed back into the chair. He gripped his leg, his face twisting in a performance of agony. "My leg," he hissed through his teeth. "The cold. It freezes the joint." Clara lowered the blanket slightly. "Is it broken?" "Old break." Silas lied. "Never set right." When the big coal comes, it is dead weight. I cannot walk on it. He watched her face carefully. He was testing her. A predator would see weakness and strike. A thief would see an opportunity to take his rifle and his money box and leave him to starve. Clara stared at him. She looked at his leg, then at his face. For a long moment, the only sound was the wind howling outside. Then, she set the cup down. "If you cannot walk," she said, her voice flat, "then who will haul the wood?" Silas suppressed a grimace of shame. "I have some inside, but not enough for a blizzard." She looked at the woodpile near the stove. It was small. Then she looked at her own hands, wrapped in the rough wool of the blanket. She did not offer pity. She did not offer sweet words. She simply nodded, a sharp, jerky motion. "I will sleep by the stove," she said. "You can take the bunk," Silas offered. "I will sit in the chair." "No," she said firmly. "The stove." She did not trust him. She wanted to be near the heat, yes, but she also wanted to be in a position where he could not corner her. That night, the storm raged with a violence that shook the cabin to its foundations. Silas lay in his bunk, feigning sleep, watching her through half-closed eyelids. Clara had curled up on the bearskin rug near the stove. She had taken a small paring knife from the table. He had seen her do it, and she held it in her hand, hidden beneath the blanket. She expected to be attacked. The realization made Silas's stomach turn. What kind of world had she walked out of, where a freezing woman had to sleep with a blade to feel safe in the house of the man who saved her? The next morning broke gray and brutal. The snow was drifted 4 feet high against the door. Silas stayed in the chair, his leg wrapped in a thick bandage he had applied for show. He dragged his heavy boot when he moved, making a production of the effort. "Water," he said. "The bucket is empty. We need to melt snow." Clara stood up. She looked stronger today, though her face was still gaunt. She picked up the bucket without a word. She unbarred the door and pushed. It would not budge against the drift. She threw her shoulder against it, gritting her teeth, until it cracked open enough for her to squeeze through. She was gone for 10 minutes. When she returned, the bucket was full of clean snow. She set it on the stove. "We need wood," she said. "The shed is round the back," Silas said, gesturing vaguely. Clara nodded. She found his heavy axe in the corner. It was too heavy for her, the handle smooth from years of his own grip. She hefted it, testing the balance. She went back out. Silas moved to the window. He scraped a small hole in the frost on the glass and watched. Clara was struggling. The snow was waist-deep in places. She waded through it to the woodpile. She set a log on the stump. She swung the axe. It was a clumsy swing. Glancing off the wood, she swung again and again. He watched her for an hour. He saw her stop to blow on her hands. He saw her wipe hair from her face, leaving a streak of blood where a splinter had caught her. She did not stop. She chopped until she had an armful, then carried it inside. She dropped the wood by the stove. Her hands were shaking. Her palms were blistered, the skin torn away in raw patches. Silas felt a surge of shame so hot it nearly made him drop his act. He wanted to stand up, take the axe, and split the cord in 10 minutes. He wanted to tell her to sit, to rest, to let him be the man, but he stayed in the chair. "Good work," he said gruffly. She did not look at him. She unwrapped her hands and stared at the blood. "I have seen men die of cold," she said quietly. "I will not be one of them." The days turned into a routine of survival. The storm passed, leaving behind a silence so profound it felt like the world had held its breath. The sky was a hard, brilliant blue, the sun reflecting off the snow with blinding intensity. Silas guided her with his voice. He sat in his chair, whittling a piece of pine, telling her how to set the snares. "Not there," he said, pointing to a diagram he had drawn on the table with charcoal. "The rabbit runs near the brush. You must set the loop at head height." "I understand," Clara said. She went out on his snowshoes, oversized webs of rawhide and ash wood that made her look like a child playing dress-up. She walked the snare line. She checked the traps. She brought back 2 snowshoe hares, frozen stiff. She learned to skin them, though her face went pale at the smell of the blood. Silas instructed her on how to save the pelt, how to gut the animal without piercing the entrails. "You have a steady hand," Silas observed one evening as she sliced the meat for a stew. "I was a seamstress," she said once. "What happened?" "My eyes were too good," she said bitterly. "They wanted me to see things I should not have seen." She did not elaborate, and Silas did not ask. But the pieces of her story began to drift out, sharp and jagged like broken glass. She spoke of a town called Silver Creek, 2 days' ride to the south. She spoke of a pastor who preached forgiveness on Sunday and turned his head when the town drunkards threw stones at stray dogs on Monday. She spoke of the respected man who had offered her work and how the town's women had turned their backs on her when his wife found out about the attention he paid her. "They called me trash," Clara said, stirring the stew. "The women in the mercantile. They pulled their skirts aside when I walked past, as if misfortune was a disease they could catch. People are small," Silas said. "The mountains are big. That is why I'm here." "You are here because you are crippled," Clara said, looking at his leg. Silas looked away. "Yes," he said, "that too." The lie was becoming a living thing in the cabin. It sat between them at dinner. It watched him when he dragged his leg across the floor. He hated himself for it. He saw the exhaustion in her shoulders, the way she rubbed her lower back after hauling water. He was a strong man, capable of bearing these burdens, and he was forcing her to carry them because he was a coward who feared solitude. But there was something else, too. He found himself watching her when she wasn't looking. He admired the line of her jaw, the stubborn set of her mouth. When the firelight caught her hair, it shone like burnished copper. He felt a stirring in his chest that he had not felt in decades. It was a dangerous feeling. It was desire, yes, but it was also a profound, aching tenderness. He wanted to protect her, and the only way he knew how to keep her safe was to keep her here. Clara, too, seemed to be changing. The haunted look in her eyes was receding, replaced by a quiet competence. She began to move around the cabin with ownership. She organized the tin cans. She swept the floor with a broom made of twigs. One evening, after a particularly hard day of hauling wood, Silas sat rubbing his knee. The ache was real enough, even if the disability was not. Clara watched him. "Does it hurt bad tonight?" she asked. "The cold gets in," Silas grunted. "Let me look at it," she said. "No," Silas said quickly. "It is fine. Don't be a fool." Silas Crow. "If it swells, the boot won't fit." She knelt before him. Silas froze. She reached out and began to unlace his boot. Her hands were rough now, calloused from the axe, but her touch was incredibly gentle. She pulled the boot off. She unwound the rags he had wrapped around his calf. The cabin was warm. The smell of pine resin and wood smoke hung in the air. Clara's head was bent over his leg. Silas could see the nape of her neck, the pale skin vulnerable and soft. She began to massage the muscle around the knee. Her fingers were strong. She rubbed the liniment he kept in a jar into his skin. The heat of her hands seemed to burn right through him. Silas stopped breathing. He stared at the top of her head. He wanted to reach out and touch her hair. He wanted to pull her up and hold her. The desire was sudden and overwhelming. A physical pain in his chest. Clara slowed her movements. She did not look up, but her hands lingered on his skin. She stopped massaging and just held his leg, her thumb tracing the line of his shin bone. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. Silas felt a flush of shame rise up his neck. He was an old man. She was a girl who had been used and discarded by men. She was bandaging him because she was kind, because she was grateful for the food, not because she wanted him. He was disgusting for even thinking it. He jerked his leg back, startling her. "That is enough," he said, his voice harsh. Clara pulled her hands back as if she had been burned. She looked up at him, her eyes wide. She saw the flush on his face, the way he refused to meet her gaze. I only wanted to help," she stammered. "I know," Silas said, turning his face toward the wall. "Put the rags back on. I am tired." She rewrapped his leg in silence. The air in the cabin had changed. It was no longer just two survivors. There was a current running between them now. Live and dangerous. Clara retreated to her side of the stove. She lay down, but she did not sleep. Silas could hear her breathing, steady and quiet, in the dark. 2 days later, the peace was shattered. The wind had died down, carrying sound for miles in the thin air. Silas was cleaning his rifle again, and Clara was mending a tear in her dress near the window. Silas's head snapped up. "Did you hear that?" he asked. Clara went still. "Hear what?" Silas held up a hand. He listened, faintly. Drifting up from the canyon below came a shout. It was a man's voice, distorted by distance, but the words were distinguishable. "Seen the girl? Drifter girl!" Clara's face went white. She dropped the needle. "They are looking for me," she whispered. Silas stood up, forgetting his limp for a fraction of a second before catching himself and grabbing the table. He moved to the window, dragging his leg heavily. He looked down the valley. Far below, against the white expanse of the snow, he saw a dark speck. A rider. "They are coming up the trace," Silas said. Clara stood up. She looked around the cabin frantically. "I have to go. I have to run. You cannot run," Silas said. "The snow is too deep. They are on horseback. They will run you down in a mile. Then hide me," she pleaded. "Please." Silas looked at her. He saw the terror in her eyes. This was not just fear of the law. This was fear of being dragged back to the hell she had escaped. He looked at the rider again. Then he looked at his own leg, wrapped in rags. If he told the truth, that he could walk, that he could fight, he would have to explain everything. But if he stayed in the chair, if he was just a crippled old hermit? "Get in the back," Silas said, his voice hard. "Behind the hanging furs. Stay quiet." "What will you tell them?" Clara asked, her voice trembling. Silas sat down in his chair. He pulled the blanket over his legs. He rested his rifle across his lap. Not threatening, but present. "I will tell them the truth," Silas said, his eyes fixing on the door. "That a crippled man cannot chase a runaway girl in 5 feet of snow. I could not have helped you even if I wanted to." He tightened his grip on the rifle stock. The lie was no longer just a way to keep her. It was her shield. And he would hold it until it broke. "Wait," he commanded. He waited for the heavy knock on the door. The storm that had buried the cabin finally broke on the 4th day, leaving behind a silence so absolute it rang in the ears. The sky cleared into a hard, relentless blue, a color that looked beautiful, but promised a cold that could snap a tree limb like a dry bone. The sun struck the white expanse of the peaks with a blinding glare, yet it offered no heat. It was a deceptive brightness, the kind that killed men who stopped to admire it without keeping their feet moving. Silas Crow watched the world from his window. The valley was a bowl of white. The pines bowed under the weight of the snow. He turned from the glass and limped heavily toward the stove, leaning his weight on a crutch he had fashioned from a curing yew branch. He dragged his right boot across the floorboards with a scraping sound that had become the metronome of their days. Clara stood by the door, wrapping a wool scarf around her face. She looked at him, her eyes tracing the line of his leg. "I am going to check the snares," she said. "The snow is crusted over," Silas warned, shifting his weight to his good hip. "It will bear your weight if you move flat. But if you break through, you will be in up to your waist." "I know," she said. "I watched the birds. They are walking on top of it today." Silas grunted, hiding his surprise. She was learning. In the week since she had arrived, Clara Hale had ceased to be the trembling creature he had pulled from the drift. She had become something harder, sharper. "I built a sled," she added, almost apologetically, "to haul the wood. Since you cannot—" She opened the door and slipped out. Silas waited a moment, then moved to the window. He watched as she dragged a contraption made of barrel staves and rawhide thongs around the corner of the cabin. It was ugly, knotted together with desperation, but it held the wood. She pulled it with a rope slung across her chest, leaning forward like a draft horse, her breath puffing in white clouds. He watched her struggle, his hands gripping the windowsill until his knuckles turned white. His leg throbbed. An echo of the old injury. But he knew he could walk. He could march out there, take the rope from her small hands, and haul the wood in 5 minutes. But he did not. He told himself it was caution. If he healed too fast, she would leave. She would pack her thin bundle and try for the pass, and the mountains would kill her. Or worse, she would make it to the next town and fall back into the hands of men who saw a woman without protection as prey. He dragged his boot back to the chair and sat down, hating the lie, and hating how much he needed it. The days settled into a rhythm defined by survival. They spoke in short sentences, measuring their words like they measured the flour in the tin. Clara worked her keep. She refused to sit idle. She scrubbed the floor with sand and hot water until the wood bleached pale. She mended his shirts, her fingers moving with a speed that made Silas dizzy to watch. One evening, by the light of the kerosene lamp, Silas laid his rifle on the table. It was a Winchester, heavy and dark with oil. "You should know how to use this," he said. Clara looked up from her sewing. "I hate guns." "Guns do not care if you hate them," Silas said. "They only care if your hand is steady. If a bear comes through that door, or a man who means you harm, hate will not stop them. This will—" He gestured for her to come closer. She hesitated, then set her needle down. She stood next to him, close enough that he could smell the scent of wood smoke and lye soap that clung to her hair. Silas opened the action. "Look here," he said. "You work the lever so it chambers the round." He guided her hands. His hands were massive, scarred and stained with grease. Hers were small and red from the cold. When his skin brushed hers, he felt a jolt that traveled up his arm and settled in his chest. He pulled back quickly, clearing his throat. "Keep the barrel down," he barked, harsher than he intended. "Never point it at anything you do not intend to kill." Clara did not flinch. She worked the lever. The metallic clack-clack loud in the small room. "Like this?" she asked. "Yes," Silas said, watching her profile. "Just like that. Later." She made him take off his coat. "Your sleeve is torn," she said. "Give it here. I can fix it," Silas grumbled. "You stitch like you are closing a wound on a mule," Clara said, holding out her hand. "Give it to me." He handed it over. She turned the fabric inside out, her needle flashing. "You waste thread," she noted without looking up. "You must catch the weave, not bunch it." Silas watched her. "Where did you learn that?" "I told you," she said. "I was a seamstress. It was the only thing my mother taught me before she died." She bit the thread and smoothed the fabric. "I was good at it," she said softly. "I was promised a place at the millinery in Silver Creek. A real job. A wage of my own." "What happened?" Silas asked. Clara looked at the fire. "The man who owned the shop, Mr. Henderson. He was a deacon, a respected man. He told me the job came with conditions." Silas felt a dark heat rise in his gut. He said nothing. "I needed the work," Clara said, her voice devoid of emotion. "I thought I could handle him. I thought if I worked hard enough, he would respect the work and leave the girl alone. But men like that, they do not want the work. They want to own the worker." She looked up at Silas, her eyes dry and hard. "When his wife found us in the back room, she did not blame him. She slapped me. She called me a harlot. She told the town I had tempted him. A week later, I was walking the road with nothing but this coat. I stole it from his porch on the way out." Silas looked at his hands. He wanted to break something. He wanted to ride into Silver Creek and find Mr. Henderson and explain the nature of sin to him with a piece of hickory. "There is a lot of dirt in this world," Silas said quietly. Clara touched her own arm, rubbing the fabric as if trying to clean a stain that went deeper than skin. "I feel it," she whispered. "I feel dirty. No matter how much water I heat, I cannot wash it off." Silas leaned forward. He looked her in the eye. "You are not dirty, Clara. You are alive." "Those are different things." He paused, the shadow of his own past darkening his face. "I killed a man once," he said. "It was 20 years ago, in a place called Dead Horse Creek." Clara went still. "Why?" "He was going to kill my brother," Silas said, so I put a knife in his ribs. It was necessary. But the blood, it does not wash off either. I see his face when the fire burns low. I scan the tree line every morning because I still expect his kin to come for the debt. He looked at the rifle on the table. We are both damaged. Clara Hale, but we are still here. The cold deepened in the 3rd week. The mercury in the thermometer outside the door vanished into the bulb. The wind died, but the air itself seemed to freeze into a solid block. Inside the cabin, the stove fought a losing battle. Frost formed on the inside of the window glass, thick ferns of ice creeping across the pane. Silas sat in his chair, wrapped in 2 blankets. Clara was by the stove, shivering so violently her teeth clicked together. You cannot sleep on the floor tonight, Silas said. Clara looked at the bunk. It was narrow, barely wide enough for one large man. I will be fine, she stuttered. You will freeze, Silas said, and I will not have a corpse to explain come spring. Bring your blankets. She hesitated, looking at the bed like it was a trap. But the cold was a more immediate threat. She gathered her buffalo robe and walked to the bunk. Silas moved to the wall, pressing himself against the rough logs to make space. Clara climbed in, keeping her back to him. They lay there in the dark, stiff and awkward, separated by inches of air that felt like miles. Silas listened to her breathing. It was shallow and fast. He could feel the tremors running through the mattress. She was shaking apart. Clara, he said into the dark. She did not answer. Silas turned. He reached out an arm and draped it over her, pulling her back against his chest. She went rigid. He could feel her muscles lock, the instinct to fight rising. Quiet, Silas whispered. It is just warmth, nothing else. He did not move his hand. He simply held her, his heavy coat acting as a radiator, sharing the heat of his body. Slowly, very slowly. The tension began to drain out of her. Her breathing slowed. The shivering subsided. She shifted, settling back against him. Her head rested near his shoulder. Silas lay staring at the ceiling, his heart hammering a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. He was terrified. He was terrified of the softness of her, terrified of the smell of her, terrified of the fact that for the first time in 20 years, he was not alone in the dark. His hand rested on her arm. He moved his thumb, just a fraction, brushing the wool of her sleeve. Clara turned in the circle of his arm. She faced him now, her face a pale blur in the darkness. Silas, she whispered. He did not move. He was afraid to breathe. She reached out and touched his face. Her fingers were cold, tracing the line of his beard, the scar on his cheek. It was a tentative touch, a question asked without words. Am I allowed to do this? Am I allowed to be this close to a man without fear? Silas caught her wrist gently. His breath hitched. Clara, he warned, his voice breaking. I am an old man. You are a warm man, she said. She moved closer. Her forehead rested against his chin. He could feel the warmth of her breath on his neck. The desire that flared in him then was not the hungry, grasping thing of his youth. It was an ache, a desperate longing to be known, to be held. He tilted his head down. Her face turned up. Their lips met. It was not a graceful kiss. It was clumsy, surprised, the friction of dry lips and the scratch of his beard. But then Clara made a small sound in her throat, a sound of need, and the kiss deepened. Silas tasted salt, tears, maybe, or sweat, and the sweetness of life. For 10 seconds. The lie did not exist. The cold did not exist. Then Silas pulled back. He pulled back as if he had been struck. He rolled away, facing the wall, his chest heaving. Shame washed over him, hot and scalding. He was taking advantage of her. She was vulnerable, scared, and grateful, and he was using that gratitude to warm his old bones. Silas? Clara's voice was small. Go to sleep. Clara, he rasped. But, sleep, he heard her shift, turning her back to him again. The distance between them was only inches, but it felt like a canyon. Silas lay awake until dawn, staring at the logs, hating himself for the lie, and hating himself even more for wishing he hadn't stopped. The next morning, the tension in the cabin was brittle. They moved around each other like strangers. Silas exaggerated his limp, dragging his leg with a grimace that felt increasingly fraudulent. He went outside to check the sky. The sun was high and bright. He stood by the corner of the cabin, shielding his eyes. For a moment, he forgot. He put his weight on his bad leg, standing tall, his back straight, looking out over the valley with the posture of the mountain man he truly was. He heard the door creak. Silas collapsed his posture instantly, grabbing the wall for support, his face twisting into a mask of pain. He looked back. Clara was standing in the doorway with the water bucket. She was looking at him. Her expression was unreadable. Had she seen him standing? Or had she just seen an old man leaning against his house? She said nothing. She walked past him to the snowbank, her eyes fixed on the ground. Silas let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. He was playing a dangerous game. 2 days later, the dogs barked. Silas didn't have dogs, but the wind carried the sound from down the valley, the sharp, aggressive yapping of trail dogs. Then came the thud of hooves on frozen ground. Silas was inside, mending a bridle. Clara was stirring a pot of beans. Riders, Silas said. Clara froze. She looked at the window. "Get away from the glass," Silas ordered. He stood up and grabbed his crutch. He moved to the chair by the fire and sat down, arranging his leg so it stuck out stiffly, wrapped in the dirty bandages. He messed his hair, trying to look more addled, more pathetic. "Who is it?" Clara whispered. "I do not know," Silas said, "but if they ask, you are not a runaway. You are my housekeeper. You are here for the wage. Do not let them see fear. Men like this smell fear like wolves smell blood." The hoofbeats stopped outside. A heavy fist pounded on the door. Silas nodded to Clara. She took a deep breath. She smoothed her dress. She walked to the door and pulled the bolt. 2 men stood on the porch. The cold air rushed in around them. The first man was tall, wearing a sheepskin coat and a badge that looked too shiny to be real. He had the narrow, predatory face of a weasel. Silas recognized him. Edgar Voss, a cousin of the deputy down in Silver Creek, a man who did dirty work and called it law. The second man was thick-set, silent, his eyes scanning the interior of the cabin over Clara's shoulder. "Well now," Edgar said, a smile stretching his thin lips that did not reach his eyes. "We heard old Silas was holed up here alone. Seems the rumors were wrong." He looked Clara up and down. It was a slow, insulting inspection. He looked at her worn boots, the patch on her dress, the way her hair was tied back. "We are checking on the residents of the district," Edgar said, stepping forward as if to enter. Clara did not move. She stood in the doorway, blocking his path. "Mr. Crow is indisposed," she said. Her voice was calm, though Silas could see her left hand trembling behind the door frame. "Indisposed?" Edgar laughed. "Is he dead?" Silas groaned from the chair. He lifted his head, squinting as if the light hurt his eyes. "I ain't dead yet." "You vulture!" Silas rasped. "Though this leg is trying to kill me." Edgar looked over Clara's shoulder at Silas. He took in the bandaged leg, the crutch leaning against the table, the gray in Silas's beard. He sneered. "Looks like winter bit you hard. Oh man, it bites us all." Silas said, "What do you want, Voss?" "Just being neighborly." Edgar said, "We heard there was a drifter girl loose in the high country. A thief, ran off from a good situation in town." He looked back at Clara. "You wouldn't know anything about that, would you, miss?" Clara met his gaze. She did not look down. "I'm employed by Mr. Crow," she said clearly. "I cook and I clean. I am working for my keep until the thaw." Edgar raised an eyebrow. "Employed?" He looked at the squalor of the cabin. "Can't imagine the pay is much." "It is honest work," Clara said, "which is more than I can say for riding 20 miles to harass a cripple and his cook." Edgar's smile vanished. His eyes hardened. "You have a sharp tongue. Girl, sharp tongues get cut in this territory." He leaned in close to her face. "Mr. Amon Price is buying up claims in this valley. Edgar said, his voice dropping to a low threat. He pays cash. Good money for old burnouts like this one. But he don't like complications. And a stray woman with a bad reputation? That's a complication. He looked past her at Silas. Price will be making an offer on this land. Silas, you'd be smart to take it. A man with one leg can't work a claim, and he can't protect assets. Edgar let his eyes linger on Clara one last time. We'll be back, he said. He turned and walked to his horse. The silent man followed. They mounted up and rode out, the sound of their horses fading slowly into the timber. Clara closed the door. She leaned her forehead against the wood. Her legs gave out, and she slid down to the floor, wrapping her arms around her knees. Silas sat in his chair, gripping the armrests. He felt a rage so pure it tasted like copper in his mouth. He could have dropped both of them before they cleared leather. He could have put a bullet in Edgar Voss's leg and dragged him down the mountain. But he had sat there. He had sat there and played the cripple while they threatened her. Clara stood up. She walked to the corner where her bundle lay. She began to pack. "What are you doing?" Silas asked. "I have to go," she said. Her voice was shaking. "They know I am here. They called me a complication. They will come back, Silas, and next time they won't just talk." "You cannot go," Silas said. "I cannot stay," Clara cried, turning to face him. She was crying now, tears of frustration and fear. "Do you not see? I am the leverage. They will use me to get to you. They will hurt you to get to me. I bring trouble wherever I go." She shoved her spare dress into the sack. "I will take the sled," she said. "I will try for the mining camp over the ridge." Silas watched her. He saw the terror in her movements. She was leaving to save him. She was willing to walk into the freezing death of the high passes so that an old man wouldn't lose his land. Silas looked at his leg. The bandage felt heavy, suffocating. If he told her the truth now, that he could walk, that he could fight, that he was the most dangerous thing on this mountain, she might stay. But if he told her the truth, he would have to admit that he had watched her slave over the woodpile for weeks. He would have to admit that he had let her empty his chamber pot and bandage a healthy limb. He would have to admit that he was a liar who had manipulated her because he was lonely. She would hate him. She would leave anyway. Not out of fear, but out of disgust. He stayed in the chair. Clara tied the bundle. She put on her coat. She walked to the door and looked back at him. "Thank you," she said softly, "for the fire." She opened the door. "Clara!" Silas shouted. She stopped, looking back with hope in her eyes. "Wait until morning," Silas said, his voice defeated. "The sun is down. The wolves will be out. Give me one more night." Clara hesitated. She looked at the darkening sky. She looked at Silas, slumped in his chair, looking older and more broken than he ever had. "One night," she whispered. She closed the door and dropped her bundle. Silas stared at the fire. The lie was no longer a test. It was a chain, and he had locked it around both of their throats. The winter of 1879 did not come gently. It fell upon the Rockies like a hammer. The respite that had allowed Clara Hale to promise one more night had been a cruel trick of the high country. By dawn of the following day, the sky had turned the color of bruised iron, and the snow began to fall again, not in drifting flakes, but in hard, driving sheets that erased the world. The pass was sealed. The valley was a tomb of white silence. Inside the cabin, the world shrank to the radius of the cast-iron stove. Weeks bled into a month. Supplies, which Silas had already worried were low, began to dwindle with terrifying speed. The flour sack grew light. The coffee tin held only dust and memories. Hunting became not a chore, but a desperate necessity, since Silas maintained the fiction of his ruined leg. The burden fell to Clara. She went out every morning on the oversized snowshoes. Silas watched her from the window, his heart twisting in his chest like a wet rag. He saw her trudge into the timber, the rifle slung over her shoulder, a weapon that looked too big for her frame. She walked miles, breaking trail through drifts that reached her thighs, searching for the track of a snowshoe hare or the dark shape of a grouse in the spruce boughs. She often returned empty-handed, her face gray with exhaustion, her lips blue. She would lean the rifle against the doorframe and try to hide the trembling of her hands as she unwound her scarf. "No luck today," she would say, her voice brittle. "The woods are empty." Silas knew they weren't empty. He knew the elk had moved down to the lower willows, 5 miles east, a distance too great for her to manage in deep snow, but an easy day's work for a man with 2 good legs. He knew where the beaver hibernated under the ice of the creek. He sat in his chair, the architect of her suffering, to assuage the guilt that gnawed at him. Silas began to perform small, invisible acts of penance. When Clara managed to snare a rabbit, he would dress it, claiming his hands were better suited to the knife work. When he portioned the stew, he would deftly slide the largest pieces of meat, the heart and the liver, into her bowl, burying them under the broth so she would not notice. "I am not hungry today," he would lie, rubbing his stomach. "The inactivity, it slows the digestion." "You eat? You are working for 2." At night, when the fire died down and the temperature in the cabin plummeted, he would wait until she was asleep, or until he thought she was asleep. He would limp to the stove, heat smooth river stones on the iron top, and wrap them in heavy wool flannel. He would slide them silently to the foot of the bunk, pressing them against the icy soles of her feet. When she stirred, murmuring in confusion, he would grunt, "Just old stones. Keeps the draft off the bed. Go back to sleep." But the cold stripped away more than just their calories. It stripped away their defenses. One evening, after a particularly brutal day where Clara had hauled 3 sled loads of wood to keep the fire alive, the need for cleanliness became a physical ache. The cabin smelled of wood smoke, old grease, and the stale confinement of 2 bodies in a small space. "I need to wash," Clara announced. She looked at her hands, stained with pitch and soot. "I cannot stand the feeling of my own skin." Silas nodded. He filled the large copper boiler with snow and set it on the stove. It took 2 hours to melt enough water for a shallow bath. He set the tin tub in front of the hearth, the only place where the air was warm enough to strip without freezing. He hung a blanket over a cord strung across the room, creating a flimsy partition. "I will turn the chair," Silas said. "I will watch the door." He sat with his back to the blanket, staring at the rough grain of the wood in the door, listening to the sounds of the water. He heard the splash as she stepped in. He heard the sigh of relief, a sound so intimate it made the hair on his arm stand up. The silence stretched. "Silas!" Clara's voice came from behind the blanket. It was soft, wavering. "Yes, the water. It is cooling fast. Could you hand me the towel? I forgot it on the table." Silas stood up. He grabbed the rough linen towel. He walked to the blanket. He reached his hand around the edge, his eyes fixed firmly on the far wall. "Here," he said. Her hand did not take it immediately. Instead, the blanket rustled. "Silas," she said again. He turned his head. Just an inch, driven by an instinct he could not control. The blanket had slipped. Clara sat in the tin tub, the water barely reaching her waist. The firelight cast dancing shadows on her wet skin, painting her in gold and amber. She was looking at him, her arms crossed over her chest, covering herself, but her back was exposed. Silas saw the scars. They were old, thin white lines crisscrossing her shoulder blades, marks of a belt or a switch, the map of a childhood or a marriage he knew nothing about. He felt a physical blow to his solar plexus. The rage that surged through him was blinding. Who had done this? A father? The respected man in town? Clara saw his eyes on her scars. She did not cover them. She lowered her arms slightly, turning to face him fully. Her expression was not one of shame, but of challenge. "Do not look away," she whispered. Silas swallowed hard. "Clara, you look at me like I am made of glass," she said, water dripping from her hair. "Like if you touch me, I will shatter. I am not glass. Silas, I am gristle and bone. I survived the snow. I survived the town." She stood up, the water sluicing off her body. She made no move to grab the towel. She stood before him, naked and shivering, demanding to be seen not as a victim, But as a woman, Silas dropped the towel. He stepped past the blanket. He reached out, his hand trembling, and touched the scar on her shoulder. His rough thumb traced the white line. "Who?" he rasped. "It does not matter," Clara said, stepping closer. "He is in the past. You are here." She reached up and took his face in her hands. Her skin was wet and hot. His was dry and weathered. The contrast was shocking. The kiss that followed was not like the first. It was not tentative. It was a collision of grief and need. Silas groaned, a sound torn from the bottom of his lungs, and pulled her against him. The dampness of her skin soaked into his shirt. He lifted her out of the tub, ignoring the protest of his bad knee, which he forgot to fake in the heat of the moment, and carried her to the bunk. They did not speak. Words were too small for the size of the feeling in the room. There was only the sound of the wind outside and the frantic, desperate shedding of clothes. When flesh met flesh, it was a revelation. Silas felt the years fall away. He felt the hard, cold knot in the center of his chest dissolve. Clara wept. She did not cry out in pain, but in release. She clung to him, her nails digging into his back, anchoring herself to the earth. She had been discarded, used, and frozen. But here, in the dark, she was cherished. Silas worshipped her with a reverence that bordered on the holy. He touched her as if she were a sacrament. When it was over, the silence returned. But it was different now. It was the silence of a storm that had finally blown itself out. They lay tangled under the buffalo robes. Clara's head rested on his chest. Silas stroked her hair, his eyes wide open in the dark. Fear began to creep back in. He held her tighter, possessed by a sudden, terrifying clarity. He loved her. He loved her with the desperate, hoarding love of a man who knows he has found a diamond in a coal chute. And because he loved her, the lie he was living became a razor blade in his gut. He had just made love to her, but he had done it under false pretenses. He was playing a role. If she knew he could walk, if she knew he had watched her suffer in the snow while he sat by the fire, this tenderness would turn to ash. "Silas," she murmured, sleep heavy in her voice. "Hush," he whispered. "Sleep." The morning brought a hard, bright sun that illuminated everything without mercy. Silas woke alone. The space beside him was warm, but empty. He sat up, panic flaring for a second until he heard the thwack of the axe outside. She was chopping wood. He swung his legs out of bed. He reached for his crutch, the deception resuming automatically, like a muscle memory. He limped to the window. Clara was by the wood pile. She was not chopping. She was standing still, the axe resting against her leg. She was looking at the ground near the corner of the cabin. Silas followed her gaze. There, stamped clearly in the snow crust from the day before, were boot prints. His boot prints. They led from the door to the lean-to where the mule, Old Bess, was stabled. Silas had gone out the previous afternoon, while Clara was napping, to check on the animal. He had walked. He had not used the crutch because the snow was slippery and the crutch was a hindrance. He had walked with a long, even stride, the stride of a healthy man. Clara looked at the prints. She walked over to them. She placed her own boot next to one, measuring the distance to the next step. It was a 4-foot stride. No cripple dragging a dead leg could make that mark. Silas held his breath. She stood there for a long time. Then, she looked up at the window. Silas jerked back into the shadows, his heart hammering against his ribs. Had she seen him? Clara did not come in raging. She did not come in asking questions. She picked up a log, walked to the door, and entered the cabin. She dumped the wood by the stove. She dusted her hands. "The coffee is ready," she said. Her voice was flat. Her eyes did not meet his. Silas took the cup she offered. "Thank you," he said. He waited for the accusation. It did not come. She moved about the cabin, sweeping the floor, folding the blankets. But the warmth from the night before was gone. She had built a wall, brick by brick, in the span of 10 minutes. She knows, Silas thought, or she suspects. and she is waiting to see if I will tell her. He opened his mouth to speak, to confess, to say I was afraid you would leave me. But before the words could form, the dogs began to bark again. This time, it was not just a courtesy call. Silas saw them through the window. 3 men. Deputy Harlan Voss was back, looking heavier in his winter coat. Beside him was the silent thug from before, and a third man, a clerk, judging by the bowler hat and the leather satchel he clutched to his chest. They did not knock. Voss kicked the door with his heavy boot. "Open up, Crow!" Silas sat in his chair, gripping the armrests. Clara stood by the stove, her face pale but composed. The door swung open. The 3 men crowded into the small room, sucking the heat out and replacing it with the smell of wet wool and aggression. "You are persistent," Silas said, keeping his voice steady. "We have business," Voss said. "Official business." He nodded to the clerk. The man in the bowler hat opened his satchel and pulled out a sheaf of papers. He looked nervous, his eyes darting to the rifle on the wall. "Mr. Crow," the clerk squeaked. "We have been reviewing the county surveys. It appears there is a discrepancy with your claim." "A discrepancy," Silas repeated. "I filed this claim 20 years ago, before this county had a name." "Yes, well," the clerk stammered, "the records from that period were informal. According to the new territorial statutes, any claim not re-registered by 1875 is considered dormant, public domain." Silas laughed. A harsh, barking sound. "You mean Price paid a judge to lose my paperwork?" Voss stepped forward. "Watch your mouth. Old man, the law is the law. This land is unregistered, which means you are squatting. And you—" Voss turned his gaze to Clara. His eyes were cold, devoid of the lecherous heat from his last visit. "This is strictly business now. We have had reports," Voss said, pulling a folded paper from his pocket, "of a woman of ill repute operating in this district. Vagrancy, lewdness, prostitution." Clara flinched as if he had slapped her. "I am a housekeeper," she said, her voice shaking with indignation. "Without a residence?" Voss countered. "Without a husband? Living in a one-room shack with a man who isn't kin, in the eyes of the law. That is a brothel, Missy." He tapped the paper against his palm. "I have a warrant here. I can drag you down to the jail in Silver Creek right now. And let me tell you, the cells are cold this time of year, and the guards, they get lonely." Silas's hands clenched into fists. He felt the muscles in his legs coil. He wanted to launch himself out of the chair and drive his thumbs into Voss's throat. But if he stood, he proved he was a liar. He proved he was the violent man they claimed he was, and they would shoot him. They would shoot him in self-defense, and Clara would be left alone with them. Clara stepped forward. She placed herself between Silas and the men. "Stop," she said. She took a breath, composing herself. She looked at the clerk, ignoring Voss. "It is a paperwork error," she said calmly. "A clerical mistake, Mr. Crow is an invalid. He could not travel to town to sign your registries." She smoothed her apron. "I will go," she said. "I will come down to Silver Creek with you today. I will act as his proxy. We will file the papers, pay the fees, and settle this legally." Silas stared at her. She was bargaining. She was offering to walk back into the lion's den to buy him time. Voss laughed. It was a cruel, ugly sound. "You think you can just sign a paper, girl? You think this is about fees?" He stepped closer to her, invading her space. "Mr. Price wants the land," Voss hissed. "He doesn't want fees. He doesn't want neighbors." He looked at Silas. "We are going to give you a choice. Crow, you sign the quitclaim deed, sell the rights to Price for $100, and we leave. We tear up the warrant for the girl. She walks away free. And if I don't?" Silas asked. Voss shrugged. "Then we take her. We lock her up. Maybe she hangs for theft. Maybe she just disappears in custody. And you starve up here when we burn your supplies. Get out," Silas growled. Voss smiled. He tipped his hat to Clara. "Think about it, darling. Freedom, or the cage. We'll be back in 2 days for the answer." They turned to leave as the silent thug passed the table. He swept Silas's coffee cup onto the floor, shattering it. The silence that followed their departure was suffocating. Clara picked up the shards of the cup. She did not look at Silas. "They're going to take the land," she said quietly. "Let them try," Silas said. "They are going to take me," she said, "over my dead body." Clara spun around. Her eyes were blazing. "Your dead body, or your crippled one?" The question hung in the air. Clara walked to him. She stood 2 feet away, searching his face. "I saw the tracks. Silas." Silas froze. "I saw the boot prints by the stable," she continued. "They were deep, even. There was no drag mark, no hole from the crutch." She lowered her voice. "Are you hiding, Silas? Are you truly helpless? Or have you been watching me break my back hauling wood for a man who could have done it himself?" Silas looked into her eyes. He saw the hurt there, a hurt deep enough to drown in. He saw the betrayal. If he told the truth now, he could stand. He could load the Winchester. He could tell her, "Yes, I can walk, and I will kill every one of them to keep you safe." But the fear paralyzed him. He was ashamed. He was ashamed of the lie. Yes, but he was also ashamed of the violence that lived inside him. He believed, deep in his soul, that if he unleashed that violence again, he would lose her anyway. She would see the killer in him and run. He looked down at his hands. I stumbled. He lied. It was a good day. The pain comes and goes. But I cannot walk to town. Clara, I cannot fight 3 men. He heard her intake of breath. It was a sound of pure disappointment. She turned away. She went back to the stove. "Fine," she said. "Then we are alone." The tragedy struck the next morning. Silas woke to a sound that chilled his blood. It was not the wind. It was the braying of the mule. Old Bess. It was a sound of agony. Then, a single gunshot. Silas threw off the blankets. He grabbed his rifle. He forgot the crutch. He scrambled to the door and threw it open. Clara was already there, standing on the porch, her hand over her mouth. In the corral, Old Bess lay on her side in the snow. Her tongue was lolling out, dark foam bubbling from her lips. She had been poisoned. Strychnine, likely. And then shot to finish it. Standing by the corral fence was the silent thug. He held a smoking pistol. He looked up at the cabin, tipped his hat, and walked away into the trees where his horse was waiting. He didn't run. He didn't need to. He knew the cripple couldn't catch him. Clara ran to the mule. She fell to her knees in the snow, stroking the animal's velvet nose. Silas stood in the doorway. He was standing on 2 legs. He raised the Winchester. He lined up the sights on the retreating man's back. It was a long shot, 200 yards, but Silas knew he could make it. He could drop the man before he reached the tree line. His finger tightened on the trigger. Then he looked at Clara. She was crying over the mule. If he shot the man, the war started now. And if the war started, Clara would be in the crossfire. He lowered the rifle. He slumped against the doorframe, letting his bad leg buckle, resuming the lie even as his soul screamed. "He is gone," Silas called out. Clara looked back at him. She saw him leaning against the doorframe. She saw the rifle lowered. She looked at the dead mule. The mule was their tractor. The mule was the only way to haul ore, to haul heavy supplies. Without the mule, the claim was worthless. Without the mule, they were trapped. She stood up. She wiped her hands on her apron. She walked back to the porch. She passed Silas without a word. Her face was like stone. They came back at noon the next day. Voss and 4 men this time. They brought a wagon. Silas was sitting in his chair. He had not eaten in 24 hours. He felt hollowed out. Voss kicked the door open. "Time's up. Crow, did you sign the deed?" Silas looked at the paper on the table. He had not signed it. "No," Silas said. Voss sighed. He looked disappointed, but his eyes were gleaming with anticipation. "Have it your way, boys." 2 of the deputies grabbed Clara. She did not scream. She did not fight. She had expected this. "Clara!" Silas roared. He gripped the arms of the chair. He started to rise. "Sit down! Oh, man!" Voss shouted, leveling a revolver at Silas's chest. or I will put a hole in you right here." Silas froze. The barrel of the Colt .45 looked like a cannon. Clara looked at him. Her eyes were filled with tears, but she held her chin high. "Do not, Silas," she said softly. "Do not get yourself killed." They dragged her out. Silas watched through the open door. He saw them hoist her into the back of the wagon. He saw them tie her hands. He sat there, a healthy man, a dangerous man, a man who loved her more than his own life. And he sat there. The lie held him down heavier than any chains. He had pretended to be helpless for so long that when the moment came to be strong, he was paralyzed by his own deception. The wagon rattled away. Voss rode behind it, looking back once to laugh. Silas Crow sat in the silence of the empty cabin. The fire was dying. The door was wide open, letting the winter kill the room. He looked at his legs. He let out a scream that tore his throat raw, a sound of pure, unadulterated self-hatred. He grabbed the table and flipped it. The tin cup flew. The papers scattered. He stood up. He stood up straight. He walked to the door, his stride long and angry. He watched the wagon disappear around the bend of the canyon. He was not a cripple. He was a fool. And now, he was a man with nothing left to lose. February in the high Rockies is a liar. The sun comes out warm enough to melt the top layer of snow, turning the trails into slick, black mud. But the nights remain cold enough to freeze a man's blood in his veins. The mountains groan under the shift of weight, the ice cracking like pistol shots, and the threat of avalanche hangs over every ridge like a suspended blade. Clara Hale sat in the back of the wagon, her hands bound with rough hemp rope. The ride down from the high valley had been a brutal descent through this treacherous landscape. The wagon lurched over ruts of frozen mud, jarring her teeth, but she refused to make a sound. She sat with her back straight, her eyes fixed on the horizon, ignoring the two deputies who rode on either side of the wagon like vultures waiting for a carcass to drop. They reached Silver Creek just as the sun was beginning to dip behind the peaks, casting long, purple shadows across the valley floor. The town was a scar on the land, a collection of false-fronted buildings and muddy streets that smelled of coal smoke, horse manure, and unwashed humanity. As the wagon rattled down Main Street, the activity of the town slowed. Men stepped out of the saloon to watch. Women shopping at the mercantile stopped and whispered behind their hands, pulling their shawls tighter as if Clara's misfortune were contagious. "Look there," a voice drifted from the boardwalk. "Voss brought the stray in." "She's been up with the hermit," another voice answered, low and suggestive. "Living in sin all winter." Clara felt the heat rise in her cheeks, but she did not look down. She remembered these faces. She remembered the baker who had closed his door when she asked for work. She remembered the pastor who had crossed the street to avoid her. She remembered the wife of the respected man. Her face twisted in self-righteous fury. She dissociated, pulling her mind back from her skin, retreating into a cold, quiet room inside her head. She noted the details with a detached, clinical precision. The jailhouse was a brick building at the end of the street. There were 3 horses tied at the rail. The deputy, Harlan Voss, looked smug, riding high in the saddle, believing he had conquered a dangerous criminal rather than kidnapped a starving woman. They did not put her in the main cells with the drunks and the brawlers. Voss had other orders. They dragged her to a boarding house near the edge of town, a place known for cheap rooms and questions that were never asked. They shoved her into a room on the 2nd floor. It was small, smelling of damp wool and stale tobacco. There was a single window, barred with iron, looking out over the alley. Voss stood in the doorway, blocking the light. "You sit tight, darlin'," he said. "Mister, Price will be along to discuss the terms of your release." "What terms?" Clara asked, her voice raspy from the cold. Voss grinned. "Simple. Silas signs the deed, and you get a train ticket to anywhere but here. He doesn't sign, and you go to the territorial prison for solicitation and theft." He slammed the door. Clara heard the heavy slide of a bolt, followed by the scrape of a chair being dragged against the wood. A guard, She moved to the window. The glass was cold. She looked down at the muddy alley. She was not crying. She was calculating. She checked the hinges on the window frame. Rusted solid. She checked the bed frame. Iron, loose leg. No. She sat on the edge of the mattress. She closed her eyes and saw Silas. Not the Silas who had stood in the doorway with the rifle, but the Silas who had sat in the chair, defeated, letting them take her. He had let them take her. The thought was a stone in her stomach, but beneath the hurt, there was a nagging question, a splinter in her mind, the boot prints, the stride. Why would a man who could walk let the woman he loved be dragged away? In the high valley, the silence was absolute. Silas Crow sat in the chair where he had spent the winter, deceiving the only person who had ever made him feel alive. The fire had burned down to gray ash. The cold was creeping in through the chinking, reclaiming the space. He looked at the crutch leaning against the table, the yew branch, worn smooth by his hand. It was a prop, a piece of theater. He stood up. He did not groan. He did not grab the table. He stood on two strong legs, the muscles stiff from the cold but functional. The ache in his hip was there. It was always there. But it was a dull roar, not a scream. He picked up the crutch. He looked at it for a long moment, hating the weight of it in his hand. Then, with a roar of pure animal rage, he swung it. He smashed it against the stone hearth. The wood shattered, splintering into jagged pieces. He threw the fragments into the dying fire. He watched them catch, the dry wood flaring up, consuming the lie. The shame hit him then, harder than any physical blow. He had let them take her. He had sat there, paralyzed by a 20-year-old fear of his own nature, terrified that if he showed his strength, he would become the monster people thought he was. But by doing nothing, he had become something worse. He had become a coward. He turned from the fire. He moved with purpose now. He went to the tin box under the bunk. He unlocked it and took out a heavy leather belt, a holster, and a hunting knife with a bone handle. He strapped the gun belt around his waist. It fit perfectly, settling on his hips like an old friend he should have never sent away. He packed a small sack, dried meat, a coil of rope, a box of cartridges. He put on his heavy coat and his hat. He walked to the door and opened it. The wind hit him, but he did not shrink from it. He stepped out onto the porch. He looked at the tracks of the wagon, churned deep into the snow and mud. They had a 6-hour head start, but they were heavy, laden with men who did not know the mountains. They would stick to the road. Silas looked at the ridgeline. The old game trail cut across the face of the peak, a narrow ledge of ice and granite that shaved 10 miles off the journey. It was suicide in the dark. It was madness in the thaw. Silas started walking. He did not limp. The mountain fought him. The snow on the south face had melted during the day and refrozen into a sheet of glass as smooth as a mirror. Silas moved without snowshoes here, using the iron hobnails in his boots to bite into the ice. He moved through the timber like a ghost. The moon rose, painting the world in silver and black. He crossed a scree slope where the rocks shifted under his feet, threatening to slide him 1,000 feet into the canyon below. He felt the burn in his lungs, the sharp bite of the thin air. He welcomed the pain. The pain was penance. He reached the overlook above Silver Creek 3 hours before dawn. The town lay below him, a cluster of yellow lights in the darkness. He could hear the faint sound of a piano from the saloon, the bark of a dog. He descended the final slope, moving through the scrub oak and pine. He did not go to the main road. He circled wide, coming in from the north, moving through the shadows of the livery stables and the warehouses. He found the boarding house. He knew the place. It was run by a widow named Mrs. Gable, who looked the other way for $1. He crouched behind a rain barrel in the alley. He watched the building. There was a light in a second-floor window. A shadow moved across the shade, below the window. At the back door, a man sat on an overturned crate, smoking a cigarette, a guard. Silas moved. He did not pull his gun. A gunshot would bring the whole town. He drew the knife. He picked up a stone and tossed it against the side of the woodshed. 20 feet away. Clack! The guard's head snapped up. He stood, hand resting on his pistol. Who is there? Silence. The guard took a step toward the shed, squinting into the dark. Just a rat, he muttered. Silas stepped out of the shadows behind him. He moved with a speed that belied his age. He wrapped his arm around the man's throat, choking off the cry, and drove his knee into the man's kidney. The guard folded without a sound. Silas dragged him into the darkness of the alley and used the man's own belt to bind his hands and feet, gagging him with a dirty handkerchief. Silas looked up at the window. It was 12 feet up. There was a drain pipe, rusted and precarious. He tested it. It groaned. It would not hold him. He looked around. He saw a stack of crates by the kitchen door. He stacked 2 of them, climbed up, and reached for the sill of the first-floor window. He hauled himself up, his boots scrambling for purchase on the siding. He reached the second-floor ledge. His breath was coming in ragged gasps. He was too old for this, but he pulled with everything he had. He peered through the glass. Clara was sitting on the bed. She was awake. She was staring at the door. Silas tapped on the glass. 3 sharp taps. Clara jumped. She spun around. She saw the dark shape in the window. She moved closer, squinting. "Silas?" she mouthed. He nodded. He tried to lift the sash. Locked. Clara understood. She looked at the door. She looked back at him and held up a finger. Wait, she went to the door. She knelt down. Silas watched, confused. What was she doing? Clara pulled a hairpin from her messy bun. She straightened it. She slid it into the keyhole. She worked it, her face pressed against the wood. Listening. She was not waiting to be rescued. She was freeing herself. Inside the room. Clara felt the tumbler click. It was a cheap lock, worn out by years of transience. She turned the knob slowly. It gave. She opened the door a crack. The chair in the hall was empty. The guard must have gone downstairs for coffee or to the privy. She slipped out. She did not run to the stairs. She ran to the window at the end of the hall that opened onto the fire escape. She threw the latch and pushed it up. Silas was already there. Having shimmied along the ledge, he climbed over the sill, landing on the floorboards with a heavy thud. He stood up, chest heaving, sweat freezing on his forehead. Clara stared at him. She stared at his legs. "You climbed," she whispered. "We have to go," Silas rasped. "Now, He grabbed her hand. They ran down the back stairs. They hit the alley just as the back door opened, and another guard stepped out. "Hey!" the man shouted. Silas didn't hesitate. He shoved Clara behind a stack of barrels and lunged. The guard raised his rifle, but Silas was inside his guard. He slammed the heel of his hand into the man's nose, hearing the crunch of cartilage. The rifle clattered to the cobbles. Silas followed with a hook to the jaw that dropped the man like a sack of grain. "Run!" Silas hissed. They ran. They splashed through the mud of the alley, weaving between the backs of buildings. A whistle blew, sharp, piercing. The town was waking up. "This way!" Clara panted. She pulled his arm, steering him left. "The old tannery. It is abandoned." She knew the town's hiding spots better than he did. She led him through a maze of fences and trash heaps, ducking under clotheslines, until they reached a dilapidated shed on the far edge of town. Near the river, they burst inside. The smell of rotting leather and old chemicals hit them. It was dark, but dry. Silas kicked the door shut and barred it with a rotting plank. He leaned back against the wall, sliding down until he hit the dirt floor. He gasped for air, clutching his side where he had pulled a muscle on the climb. Clara stood in the center of the room. She was breathing hard, but her eyes were fixed on him. She walked over to him. "Stand up," she said. Silas looked up at her. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind the cold reality of what had just happened. "Clara," he said, "stand up. Silas." He placed his hands on the wall and pushed himself up. He stood straight. He did not lean. He did not sway. Clara looked at his legs. She looked at the way he held his weight, evenly, powerfully. "You can walk," she said. It was not a question. "Yes," Silas said. You could walk the whole time. Yes, she stepped closer. Her hand came up. Crack. She slapped him across the face. It was a hard, stinging blow that rocked his head to the side. You liar, she hissed. You selfish, stubborn, old bastard. Silas turned his face back to her. He took it. He deserved it. You let me drag that sled, she cried, tears finally spilling over. You let me freeze my hands. You let me think I was keeping you alive. I was afraid, Silas shouted back, his voice echoing in the small shed. Afraid of what? Of walking. Afraid of you. Silas grabbed her shoulders. I was afraid that if you knew I was whole, you would leave. I was afraid that if I was just a man, just a lonely, violent man, you would see no reason to stay. I needed you to need me. He shook her slightly, his grip desperate. And when they came, when Voss came, I was afraid that if I stood up, I would kill them. I was afraid I would become the killer again. And you would see the blood on my hands and run. Clara stared at him. The anger in her eyes warred with something else. Relief, pain, understanding. You think I stayed because you were crippled? She asked, her voice breaking. Why else would a woman like you stay with a man like me? Silas asked. Because you were kind, Clara screamed. Because you were the first man who didn't try to take something from me. Because you gave me the best meat and heated stones for my feet. She shoved his chest hard. I didn't fall in love with your limp, Silas Crow. I fell in love with you, and you let them drag me away because you were too busy hiding from yourself. Silas stood frozen. The words hung in the air. I fell in love with you. He looked at her face, streaked with mud and tears. He saw the fire in her eyes. I am sorry, he whispered. I am so sorry. Clara. Clara's shoulders slumped. The fight drained out of her, replaced by a trembling exhaustion. She stepped forward and buried her face in his chest. You are a fool, she sobbed into his coat. I know, Silas said, wrapping his arms around her. I know. He held her tight, crushing her against him. He buried his face in her hair. He felt her shaking, and he felt his own body trembling in response. I came for you, he said. I walked the ridge. I climbed the wall. I am done hiding. Clara pulled back. She looked up at him. Show me, she whispered. Show you what? Show me you are here. Show me you are real. She pulled his head down and kissed him. It was a kiss of desperation, of reclaiming. It tasted of salt and fear and survival. Silas groaned. He kissed her back, pouring every ounce of his regret and his love into the motion. His hands moved over her back, feeling the strength of her, the reality of her. They sank to the floor, onto a pile of old sacking. The cold of the shed didn't matter. The danger outside didn't matter. There was a frantic urgency to their touch. Buttons were undone with fumbling fingers. Skin met skin, hot and demanding. Silas held her face, looking into her eyes, needing her to see him, all of him, the broken parts and the strong parts. I am here, he whispered against her skin. I am yours. Clara pulled him closer. Don't you dare hide from me again, she breathed. The darkness of the shed swallowed them, but it was a warm darkness now. The scene faded into the rhythm of two people finding solace in each other, a physical affirmation that they were alive, that they were together, and that the lie was finally, irrevocably dead. Dawn came gray and wet. The light filtered through the cracks in the shed walls, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. Silas and Clara sat against the wall, wrapped in his heavy coat. They shared the dried meat Silas had brought, chewing slowly. We cannot stay here, Silas said. They will search the outbuildings when the sun is up. Clara nodded. We should go to the railhead, catch the freight train east. Silas looked at her. Is that what you want? To run? Clara stopped chewing. She looked at the muddy toes of her boots. I have been running for 3 years. She said, I ran from my father. I ran from the town. I ran from the scandal. She looked up, her jaw set. If we run, they win. Price takes the land. Voss keeps his badge. And everyone in this town goes on believing I am a whore and you are a helpless old fool. Silas wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. He checked the cylinder of his revolver. "I am tired of running too," he said. He stood up. He offered his hand to Clara. She took it, and he pulled her to her feet. "Price is a businessman," Silas said. "He relies on paper. He relies on secrets. And Voss relies on fear," Clara added. She reached into the pocket of her dress. She pulled out a small, crumpled piece of paper. "When I was in the room," she said, "I heard them talking in the hall. Price was arguing with Voss about the payment. He gave Voss a promissory note. Voss dropped it when he was gloating. I picked it up before he saw." She unfolded the paper. It was a bank draft, signed by Eamon Price, payable to Harlan Voss for services rendered regarding the Crow claim. "It is proof," Silas said, a grim smile touching his lips. "Bribery. Conspiracy. It is only proof if a judge sees it." Clara said, "The circuit judge is in town today. I saw his carriage at the hotel when they brought me in." Silas holstered his gun. He adjusted his hat. "Then we have an appointment," he said. "Are you ready?" Clara asked. "They will stare. They will talk." "Let them talk," Silas said. "I am done caring what they say. I only care what you say." Clara brushed the dirt from her dress. She smoothed her hair. She hooked her arm through his. "Walk with me." "Silas Crow," she said. Silas opened the door of the shed. The morning light was blinding for a moment. They stepped out into the mud of the riverbank. They walked up the embankment to the main street. The town was waking up. Shopkeepers were sweeping the boardwalks. Men were heading to the mines. Heads turned. They saw Clara Hale, the ruined woman, walking with her head high. And they saw Silas Crow. He was not limping. He was not bent over a crutch. He was walking with a long, powerful stride, his back straight, his eyes scanning the street with a predator's intensity. He looked 10 years younger. He looked like the mountains themselves, unyielding and dangerous. A silence rippled down the street. The whispers stopped. Silas felt Clara's hand tighten on his arm. He covered her hand with his own. He looked at the faces of the townspeople, the ones who had spat on her, the ones who had mocked him. He met their gazes until they looked away. He was Silas Crow. He was walking, and he dared anyone to try and stop him. The walk up Main Street was a gauntlet. The morning sun had turned the frozen ruts of Silver Creek into a quagmire of black mud, but the filth underfoot was nothing compared to the looks that greeted them. Silas Crow walked with his head up. He did not rush. He felt the phantom weight of the crutch he had burned, and every step he took on 2 strong legs was a declaration of war against the town's perception of him. Clara Hale walked beside him, her hand tucked into the crook of his arm. She wore her tattered dress and the ill-fitting man's coat, but she carried herself like royalty in exile. The town had awakened to the scandal. Gossip in a mining camp moved faster than a grass fire. By the time they reached the Mercantile, the boardwalk was lined with spectators. "Look at them," a woman whispered loud enough to be heard. "It is unnatural. He is old enough to be her father?" Another hissed, clutching a prayer book like a shield. "Disgusting." Silas felt Clara's grip tighten on his sleeve. He covered her hand with his own, his leather glove rough against her skin. "Keep looking forward," he murmured. "Do not give them the satisfaction. I hear them." "Silas," she said, her voice steady. "They do not hate us because of the age. They hate us because we are surviving without their permission." They reached the steps of the Hotel Colorado, where the circuit judge, Thaddeus Moore, was known to hold court when the snow allowed passage. A group of men stood by the door, smoking cigars. They were miners, mostly, men with coal dust in their creases. They smirked as the couple approached. "Morning." "Silas," one of them called out. "See, you found a miracle cure for that leg. Must be quite a nurse you got there." The men laughed, a low, ugly sound. Silas stopped. He turned slowly to face them. He let his coat fall open, revealing the heavy colt on his hip. He did not reach for it. He simply let it be seen. The laughter died in their throats. Silas held the gaze of the loudest man until the miner looked down at his boots. Silas turned back to the door and held it open for Clara. Judge Thaddeus Moore was a man carved from the same granite as the mountains. He sat behind a heavy oak table in the hotel's parlor, which had been converted into a temporary courtroom. He was nursing a cup of coffee and reading a newspaper that was 3 months old when Silas and Clara entered, followed by a ripple of curious onlookers. The judge lowered his paper. He peered over his spectacles. Silas Crow. The judge said, "I heard you were dead or crippled, depending on who was buying the whiskey." "I am neither." "Judge," Silas said. "So I see." Judge Moore looked at Clara. "And you must be the woman causing all the fuss. The one Deputy Voss is so eager to arrest." "I am Clara Hale," she said, "and I am not causing fuss. I am causing trouble for men who prefer their women silent." The judge raised an eyebrow. He gestured to the chairs. "Sit." Silas and Clara sat. The room began to fill up behind them. The air grew thick with the smell of wet wool and anticipation. "We are here to file a complaint," Silas stated, "against Eamon Price and Deputy Harlan Voss for extortion, false imprisonment, and conspiracy to steal a mining claim. Serious charges." The judge said, "You have proof?" Before Silas could answer, the doors banged open. Eamon Price strode in, wearing a suit that cost more than Silas's cabin. Harlan Voss followed, his face a mask of thunder, his hand resting on his gun. "Judge," Voss shouted, "this man is a squatter and a fraud, and that woman is a fugitive. I have a warrant right here." Voss waved the paper. Judge Moore slammed his hand on the table. "Quiet," the judge roared. "This is a court of law, deputy, not a saloon brawl. Sit down or I will have you shackled." Price placed a calming hand on Voss's shoulder. They took the seats opposite Silas and Clara. Price smoothed his silk tie. He looked at Silas with a pitying smile. "Your Honor," Price said, his voice like oiled leather, "we are simply trying to enforce the statutes. Mr. Crow's claim is unregistered. He is mentally unfit, a violent recluse. And this girl is a known vagrant who has been manipulating a senile old man." Silas felt the rage boil in his gut, but he remembered the plan. Restraint. "I am not senile," Silas said, "and the claim is valid. I staked it in 58. Price laughed softly. "And then you spent the winter playing the cripple. The whole town knows it. Silas, you pretended you couldn't walk. Why would a sane man do that? Unless he was hiding something. Unless he was deranged." The room murmured agreement. It was the weak point in Silas's armor, and Price knew it. Silas stood up. He felt the eyes of the town on him, judgmental, mocking. He looked at Clara. She nodded. A tiny, imperceptible movement. "Yes," Silas said, his voice carrying to the back of the room. "I pretended." He turned to face the crowd. "I dragged my leg for 3 months. I let a woman haul my wood. I let her hunt my food. I lied to her, and I lied to you." "Why?" Judge Moore asked. "Because I was afraid," Silas said. The murmurs stopped. A mountain man did not admit fear. "I have lived alone for 20 years. Silas continued. "I forgot how to trust. When this woman fell on my doorstep, I thought she would rob me. Then, when I realized she was good, I feared she would leave me. I thought if I was broken, she would stay out of pity, because I did not believe anyone would stay with me out of love." He looked at Price. "I lied because I was lonely, Mr. Price, not because I was crazy, and certainly not to steal what was already mine." It was a humiliating admission. Silas saw the shock on the faces of the men in the back. He had stripped himself bare, but in doing so, he had taken the weapon out of Price's hands. He was no longer a monster. He was just a sad, flawed man. Price sneered, sensing the shift in the room. "Touching," he said, "but character is not evidence. The fact remains, the land is unregistered, and the girl is a criminal." Price leaned forward. "And let us not forget, Judge, who Silas Crow really is. He is the butcher of Dead Horse Creek. He killed a man in cold blood 20 years ago. That is the violence he is hiding. And now he has a whore in his cabin, likely helping him rob travelers." The slur hung in the air. Clara stood up. She did not shout. She did not cry. She walked to the table and placed her hands flat on the wood. "I am not a whore," she said clearly. Price rolled his eyes. "They all say that. My dear," Clara turned to the judge, "I was a seamstress in this town 3 years ago. She said, "I worked for Mr. Henderson, a respected man, an associate of Mr. Price." Price stiffened. "Mr. Henderson forced himself on me." Clara said, "When I refused to be his mistress, he destroyed my name. He told the town I was the aggressor. He cast me out." She looked at the older women in the front row, the ones who had whispered. "You all believed him, because he wore a suit and I wore an apron. You spat on me. You let me freeze. You call me a sinner because it is easier than admitting you allowed a predator to walk your streets." She reached into her pocket. "But predators get sloppy," Clara said. She pulled out the crumpled bank draft she had lifted from Voss. She smoothed it out on the judge's desk. "I heard Mr. Price and Deputy Voss talking when I was locked in the boarding house. Clara said, 'This is a bank draft for $200, signed by Eamon Price, payable to Harlan Voss.'" She pointed to the memo line. "It says, 'For services rendered.' Crow claim." The judge picked up the paper. He adjusted his spectacles. He looked at Voss. "Deputy?" the judge asked. "Care to explain why a land speculator is paying you $200? That is 4 years' salary." Voss turned the color of ash. It was a loan, Your Honor. A personal loan." Clara pulled another piece of paper from her pocket. It was a page torn from a small notebook she had found in the tannery shed. Silas hadn't known she had it. It was old, but the handwriting was distinct. "This is a list of names." Clara said, "I found it in the trash behind the land office when I was begging for scraps last year. It lists claims, and next to them, it lists bribes." She read from the page. "Henderson, $50. Voss, $10. Judge Holloway, $100. She looked at Price. "Mr. Henderson is on your payroll, isn't he? He ruins the women, you steal the land, and the law looks the other way. It is a system, and I am done being crushed by it." The room exploded. The respected man, Mr. Henderson, was a pillar of the community. To hear his name dragged into the mud alongside Price changed everything. The women who had judged Clara suddenly looked uncertain. If Henderson was corrupt, who else was? Price stood up, his face red. "This is slander. She forged those papers. She is a liar and a tramp." Judge Morse slammed his gavel. "Silence." The judge looked at the bank draft. He looked at the notebook page. He looked at Silas, standing tall and armed, and Clara, shaking but defiant. Then he looked at Voss. "Deputy, hand over your badge." Voss blinked. "What? Your badge? Voss, you are relieved of duty pending a federal inquiry into corruption." Voss looked at Price. Price stared straight ahead, his jaw working. Voss slowly unpinned the star and threw it on the table. "As for you, Mr. Price," the judge said, "this court finds the claim of Silas Crow to be valid by right of possession and improvements made. The lack of registration is deemed a clerical error, likely caused by the very corruption this court intends to investigate." Price grabbed his hat. "You cannot do this. I have friends in Denver, powerful friends. I suggest you go find them," Judge Moore said, "because if you are in Silver Creek at sundown, I will have you arrested for attempted fraud." Price glared at Silas. His eyes were venomous. "This isn't over. Crow," he whispered. He turned and stormed out. Voss followed him, casting one last hateful look at Clara. The courtroom remained quiet. The townsfolk looked at Silas and Clara differently now. The shame had shifted. It no longer rested on the couple. It hung over the town itself. They walked out of the hotel into the blinding afternoon light. They did not stop until they reached the back of the livery stable, away from the prying eyes of the street. The smell of hay and horses was grounding. Clara leaned back against the rough wood of the stable wall. She slid down until she was crouching in the dirt. "Clara?" Silas knelt beside her. She let out a sob. It was a raw, tearing sound. She covered her face with her hands. "It is over," Silas said, reaching for her. "You did it." "You beat them. I was so scared." She wept. "I was so scared my voice would stop working." It rang like a bell. Silas said. He pulled her hands away from her face. He wiped the tears from her cheeks with his thumbs. "You were amazing." Clara Hale, you stood there and you shamed the devil himself. Clara looked at him. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her face blotchy. They know, she whispered. They know about Henderson. They know I was innocent. Silas nodded. They know. He pulled her into his arms. He held her differently than he had in the cabin. There was no desperation now, only a profound, anchoring peace. He held her as if he were holding something precious that he had almost lost. Clara buried her face in his neck. She smelled of sweat and fear. But to Silas, it was the best smell in the world. Silas, she said against his skin. What happens now? Silas pulled back slightly. He looked into her eyes. We go home, he said. We plant the garden. We rebuild the mule shed. He paused, searching for the words. He was not a poet. He was a man who had spent a lifetime in silence. I cannot promise you it will be easy. He said, the winter will come back. The work is hard. And I am an old man with a bad past. He took her hand and pressed it to his chest, over his heart. I cannot promise you forever. Clara, I do not have forever to give. But I promise you tomorrow, and the day after that, as long as there are days left in me, they are yours. Clara squeezed his hand. Tomorrow's enough, she whispered. She leaned in and kissed him. It was a soft kiss, tasting of salt and hope. It was a seal on a contract more binding than any paper Judge Moore could sign. The sun was setting by the time they gathered their supplies. They bought a new mule, a sturdy bay, with the last of Silas's coin. They loaded the sacks of flour, the coffee, the ammunition. They were tightening the cinch when a boy ran up to them. It was the stable boy, breathless and wide-eyed. Mr. Crow, he panted. What is it, son? Silas asked. The marshal. He tried to arrest Mr. Price at the train station, but Price had men waiting. There was a shooting. Silas went still. Is Price in custody? No, sir. He got away. And Voss, too. They took horses. Which way did they go? Silas asked, his voice dropping to a growl. The boy pointed toward the purple peaks in the west. Up the canyon road. Sir, toward the high country. Silas looked at the mountains. The peaks were shrouded in shadow. The snow turning blue in the twilight. They are going to the claim. Clara said. Her voice was flat. They know they cannot win in court. Silas said. So they are going to burn us out. They want the ore, or they want revenge. Likely both. He checked his rifle scabbard. He checked the cinches on the saddles. Clara, Silas said, stay here. Stay at the hotel. I will go up and finish this. Clara swung herself into the saddle of the rented mare. She looked down at him. I told you, Silas. I am done hiding, and I am done running. She pulled her coat tight. That is our home. If they want it, they have to go through both of us. Silas looked at her. He saw the steel in her spine. He realized then that he could not stop her, and more importantly, he did not want to. She was his partner. He mounted his horse. He pulled his hat low against the rising wind. Keep your rifle loose, he said. They rode out of Silver Creek as the darkness fell, leaving the lights of the town behind. They climbed into the black throat of the canyon, where the law of men did not reach, and where the land itself would decide who survived the night. The return to the high country was a journey through a world in violent transition. Spring in the Rockies was not a gentle awakening. It was a riot of water and mud. The snowpack, destabilized by the warming days, bled into the creeks until they roared like freight trains, brown and frothing with silt. The trails that had been hard-packed ice in January were now treacherous slides of slush and gravel that threatened to send horses tumbling into the ravines. Silas Crow and Clara Hale rode in silence for much of the climb, not out of tension, but out of necessity. The path demanded their eyes and their hands. Silas rode lead on the rented mare, picking a line through the washouts. Clara followed on the new bay mule, her body moving in rhythm with the animal, her eyes scanning the ridge lines, not with the panic of prey, but with the alertness of a woman returning to her territory. They reached the cabin as the sun began to bleed behind the western peaks. The structure looked small against the vastness of the thawing valley. The door was still hanging open from where Voss's men had dragged Clara out, a dark mouth gaping in the gray logs. The corral was empty, save for the dark stain in the snow where old Bess had died. It looked like a ruin. But to Silas, seeing Clara slide from the saddle and stand on the porch, it looked like the only cathedral that mattered. "We have work to do," Clara said, pulling off her riding gloves. Silas dismounted. He felt the ache in his hip, a real ache, born of hours in the saddle and the damp air. "My hip is stiff," he said. He did not grunt or hide it. He simply stated it. Clara looked at him. She nodded. "Then you take the horses to the lean-to," she said. "I will start the stove." It was a small exchange, but it carried the weight of a revolution. There was no pretense, no test, just two people sharing the load. The next 2 weeks were defined by the labor of rebuilding. They did not just repair the cabin, they reclaimed it. Silas rehung the door. Reinforcing the hinges with fresh iron straps he forged in the small coals of the stove. He checked the perimeter every morning, not with the paranoia of a man hiding a secret, but with the prudence of a man protecting a treasure. Clara began to make the space hers. It was not a sudden transformation, but a series of small, radical assertions of existence. She found a bolt of yellow calico in her bundle, fabric she had saved from her seamstress days, and sewed curtains for the greasepaper window. When the sun hit them, the grim interior of the cabin was bathed in a warm, buttery light. She found a tin can, punched holes in the bottom, and filled it with soil. She placed it on the windowsill. "What is that?" Silas asked one evening, watching her press tiny dark seeds into the dirt. "Geraniums," she said. "I found the seeds in my pocket. I forgot they were there. You cannot eat geraniums," Silas noted. "No," Clara said, patting the dirt down. "But you can look at them, and they are beautiful. We have enough things to keep us alive. Silas, we need things to make us glad we are living." Silas watched her hands. He remembered how cracked and bleeding they had been in the winter. Now they were healing, though the calluses remained. "You are right," he said softly. He learned to apologize with his actions. He stopped hoarding the decision-making. When it came time to shore up the roof against the spring rains, he did not bark orders. "The pitch is shallow on the north side," Silas said, standing by the ladder. "If we use the split logs there, the weight might be too much." "What do you think?" Clara looked at the roof. She squinted against the sun. "Use the cedar shakes for the north," she suggested. "They are lighter. We can save the logs for the wall repair." Silas nodded. "Good. Hand me the hammer." It was a partnership, but healing was not a straight line. There were mornings when Clara woke up screaming, thrashing in the blankets as the memory of the cell or the wagon clawed at her. On those days, she would retreat into herself, sitting by the creek for hours, staring at the rushing water. In the past, Silas would have tried to fix it. He would have offered food, or distraction, or tried to control her mood to assuage his own anxiety. Now, he learned the hardest skill of all, patience. He would bring her a cup of coffee and set it on a rock beside her. "I'm going to check the south ridge," he would say. "I will be back in an hour." He gave her space. He let her feel the safety of being alone without being abandoned. And when he returned, she would usually be back at the cabin, the shadow gone from her eyes, ready to work again. "You came back," she said once, as if surprised. "I said I would," Silas answered. The thaw brought the green grass, but it also brought the inevitable reckoning. It happened on a Tuesday, under a sky of volatile gray clouds. Silas was down in the mine shaft, checking the shoring timbers. Clara was by the creek, washing clothes in the icy water. She heard the snap of a branch. It was not the random crack of nature. It was the heavy, clumsy sound of a boot on dry wood. Clara went still. She did not stand up immediately. She kept her hands in the water, scrubbing the shirt, but her eyes shifted to the tree line across the creek. She saw the flash of movement, a horse's flank, the glint of metal. She did not scream. A scream would bring Silas running into an ambush. She stood up slowly, picking up the basket of wet laundry. She turned and walked toward the cabin, keeping her back straight, forcing herself not to run. As soon as she broke the line of sight behind the woodpile, she dropped the basket. She grabbed the heavy iron triangle hanging on the porch, the dinner bell, and struck it. Clang, clang, clang. 3 hard strikes, the signal for danger. Silas emerged from the mine shaft instantly, his rifle in his hand. He did not run toward her. He ran toward the cover of the boulders near the mine entrance, scanning the perimeter. "Clara!" he shouted. "Tree line!" she called back. "East Ridge!" 2 shots rang out. Crack thwack! A bullet splintered the log of the porch rail inches from Clara's hip. She threw herself to the ground, crawling behind the woodpile. From the trees, voices echoed. "Come out! Crow! It's over!" It was Eamon Price. His voice was high and thin, edged with hysteria. Silas crouched behind the boulder. He saw them now. Price was on a roan horse, keeping back in the timber, but dismounting and moving through the brush was Harlan Voss, carrying a lever-action rifle, and behind him, another man, a hired gun Silas didn't know. They had come to wipe the slate clean. Silas jacked around into the chamber of his Winchester. He measured the distance. 100 yards. Uphill. He could kill Voss. He had the shot. But he remembered the courtroom. He remembered the look in Clara's eyes when she spoke of justice. If he killed them, he was the butcher again. If he killed them, the law would eventually come for him, and Clara would be alone. He fired a warning shot, kicking up dirt at Voss's feet. "Back off! Harlan!" Silas roared. "The marshal knows you are here." Voss laughed, ducking behind a pine. "The marshal is a day's ride away." "Old man, by the time he gets here, the buzzards will have picked you clean." Voss fired again, suppressing Silas. The third man moved to the left, trying to flank the cabin. They were pinning Silas down to get to Clara. Clara lay behind the woodpile. She saw the third man moving through the willows, circling toward the back of the cabin. He was moving across the patch of ground where the spring runoff pooled before draining into the creek. It was a mud sink. In winter, it was frozen solid. In summer, it was dry hardpan. But in May, it was a soup of clay and silt 3 feet deep, hidden under a layer of deceptive moss. Clara looked at Silas. He was pinned by Voss's fire. He couldn't see the flanker. Clara realized she was the only one who could stop him, and she didn't have a gun. She looked at the laundry rope she had strung between the cabin corner and the shed. She looked at the sled she had built in winter, leaning against the wall. She did not hide. She moved. She grabbed the sled. She ran, not away from the attacker, but parallel to him, splashing through the shallow mud, drawing his eye. "Hey!" she shouted. The gunman saw her. A woman. An easy target. He grinned and turned, stepping out of the willows to cut her off. He stepped right where she wanted him. He took a heavy step onto the mossy patch. His boot punched through. The suction was instant. He stumbled, trying to pull his foot free, but his other foot sank. The clay gripped him like a vice. "Damn it," he yelled, thrashing, which only sank him deeper. Clara didn't stop. She ran to the shed, grabbed the coil of rope, and circled back. The man was waist-deep now, his rifle held high, struggling to aim at her while the mud sucked at his balance. "Drop it!" Clara yelled. He swung the rifle toward her. Clara threw the coil. She didn't aim for him. She threw the heavy loop over the stump of a lightning-struck pine 10 feet behind him. She pulled the slack tight, creating a tripwire between him and solid ground. "If you shoot, you sink!" she screamed. "The recoil will bury you." The man hesitated. He knew physics as well as anyone. He was already sinking fast. Silas, seeing the flanker trapped, turned his attention back to Voss. Voss broke cover, charging the porch, thinking Silas was distracted. Silas rose from the rocks. He didn't shoot Voss. He stepped into the open, calm as a statue. "Harlan!" Voss looked up, startled by the shout. Silas didn't fire. He levered the rifle, ejecting a live round, and simply pointed the barrel at Voss's chest. It was a display of supreme arrogance. It was a message. "I can kill you, but I am choosing not to." Voss froze. He looked at Silas's steady hands. He looked at the hired gun screaming in the mud pit. He looked at Price, who was already turning his horse to run. "Drop it," Silas said. His voice was not a roar. It was a quiet, terrible thing. Voss's hands shook. He looked at the gun, then at Silas. I was just following orders," Voss stammered. "Drop it." Voss threw the rifle down. He raised his hands. Silas walked down the slope. He kept his eyes on Voss. "Get on your knees," Silas ordered. Voss sank into the mud. Silas walked past him to where Price was struggling to turn his horse in the thick brush. Silas whistled. A sharp, piercing sound. Price's horse, spooked, reared up. Price, a city man in a saddle, lost his seat and tumbled backward, landing hard in a patch of briars. Silas walked over to him. Price scrambled backward, crab walking away. "Don't kill me," Price squealed. "I have money. I can pay you." Silas looked down at him. He looked at the man who had orchestrated their misery. He felt the old urge, the red tide, rising in his blood. It would be so easy. A squeeze of the trigger, and the nightmare was over. He felt Clara's presence. She had walked up behind him. She was muddy, breathing hard, holding the end of the rope she had used to trap the gunman. "Silas," she said softly. Silas looked at her. "He is not worth the bullet," she said. Silas let out a long breath. The red tide receded. He lowered the hammer of the Winchester. "You are right," Silas said. He reached down, grabbed Price by his silk collar, and hauled him to his feet. "You are going to walk to town. Amen," Silas said. "And you are going to tell the marshal exactly what you did. And if I don't?" Price sneered, trying to regain some dignity. Silas smiled. It was a smile that did not reach his eyes. "Then I will let Clara decide what to do with you. And she is much less forgiving than I am." They tied the three men together with the laundry rope. It was a slow, miserable procession down the mountain. The marshal, who had indeed been tracking the fugitives, met them 5 miles down the trail. The lawman looked at the 3 battered prisoners. He looked at Silas, standing tall, and Clara, muddy but unbowed. "You saved the county the cost of a hanging." "Crow," the marshal said, spitting tobacco juice into the snow. "These boys will be breaking rocks in Yuma for a long time." He tipped his hat to Clara. "Ma'am, my apologies for the trouble. It wasn't trouble." "Marshal," Clara said, looking at Silas. It was house cleaning. The sun was setting by the time they returned to the cabin alone. The valley was bathed in a deep, purple twilight. The adrenaline had faded, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion. They sat on the porch steps. Silas had a bottle of medicinal whiskey. He took a pull and handed it to Clara. She took a sip, grimacing at the burn, and handed it back. "It is done," Silas said. "Really done?" Clara asked. "The claim is safe. The papers are filed. Price is in chains." He looked at his hands. "I didn't kill him. Clara, I wanted to, but I didn't. I saw," she said. "You chose to be a man, not a memory." Silas looked at her. The fading light caught the copper in her hair. She looked tired, her face streaked with mud, her dress torn at the hem. She was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. "I am 59 years old. Clara," Silas said, "the years are going to move fast now. I have scars that ache when it rains. I have nightmares that won't go away entirely." He turned to face her fully. "I cannot give you a young man's life. I cannot give you dances and parties and a house in the city." Clara reached out and took his hand. Her fingers were rough, warm, and real. "I have had a young man's love. Silas, it was selfish and fleeting. I have had the city. It was cold and cruel." She leaned her head on his shoulder. "I do not want a fantasy. I want this. I want the work. I want the quiet. I want the man who heats stones for my feet." She looked up at him. "I choose you, Silas." "Not because I have nowhere else to go, but because there is nowhere else I want to be." Silas felt a wall inside him crumble, the last fortification he had built around his heart. He realized that she wasn't staying because he had tricked her, or because she was trapped. She was staying because she saw him, all of him, and she stayed anyway. He leaned down and kissed her. The wind picked up, swirling down from the peaks. A late spring storm was rolling in, the clouds obscuring the stars. It would snow tonight, a wet, heavy snow that would melt by noon. But inside the cabin, the stove was warm. They went inside and bolted the door. Not against the world, but to keep the warmth in. That night, as the wind rattled the new shingles, there was no desperation in their touch. There was a slow, deliberate unraveling of defenses. Silas let himself be loved. He let himself believe that he deserved the softness of her skin against his. Clara let herself be cherished, letting go of the shame she had carried like a shield. They lay in the dark, limbs tangled, listening to the storm. "Thank you," Silas whispered into the darkness. "For what?" Clara murmured sleepily. "For walking into the snow," he said. "For saving me. You saved me first." She said, "No," Silas said, pulling the quilt tighter around them. "I just opened the door. You did the rest." The morning broke with a clarity that hurt the eyes. The storm had passed, leaving a dusting of fresh white on the peaks. But the valley floor was green and vibrant. The sun crested the eastern ridge, turning the melting snow into diamonds. Silas stood on the porch, a mug of coffee in his hand. He watched the steam rise, curling into the crisp air. The door opened behind him. Clara stepped out. She wrapped a blanket around her shoulders and stood beside him. She didn't speak. She just leaned against him. Silas put his arm around her. He looked out at the land. He saw the mine entrance, dark and promising. He saw the garden patch where the geraniums would grow. He saw the trail leading down to the town, a road they could travel now without fear. He looked at Clara. She was watching the sunrise, a small smile on her lips. They were survivors. They were scarred, imperfect, and mismatched by the standards of the world, but standing there, hand in hand, watching the light flood the valley. They were something else. They were free. The lie was gone. The truth was hard, but it was theirs, and as the sun climbed higher, burning off the mist, Silas Crow realized that for the first time in his life, he wasn't waiting for the winter. He was ready for the spring. Thank you for listening to this story. If this tale of survival, justice, and unlikely love in the high Rockies resonated with you, I invite you to share your thoughts. Where are you listening from today? Did Silas and Clara's journey move you? Please consider subscribing to From Wild West for more stories of the American frontier, tales of grit, redemption, and the human spirit. Leave a comment below in English. I would love to hear from you. Until the next time, keep your powder dry and your eyes on the horizon.